Dead Air Studios presents The Pain Chaser 1, Ambuscade, by Patrick E. Malloy, read for you by the author. This recording is released under a Creative Commons 4.0 license, so feel free to share it with your friends or enemies, but always give appropriate credit. This story is not intended for children and contains profanity, violence, and disturbing content that some people may find offensive. If you're in doubt, please turn back now, as you may find that some doors, once opened, refuse to be shut. Six. The teacher's lounge was quite a bit larger than the office had been, but was just as bare. There was, however, a bathroom and a small kitchen niche with running water off to one side. Rob dropped his load unceremoniously on the floor in the center of the room. Okay, I'm going to have a look around in the cafeteria for something for us to eat. I noticed before that they already stocked the freezers. Anyone want to come? I'll go, Steve said, dropping his things as well. Are we going to be stuck eating microwave pizza? Anton asked. No microwave, Rob said. No, Steve said thoughtfully, but there's probably canned food and cereal. Let's go. Rob and Steve disappeared to find the food, while the others set up makeshift beds on the floor. They passed the time by asking one another questions from one of the board games Steve had brought along. 20 minutes later, Steve and Rob returned with the promised food and everyone's mood had improved. Even Tabby seemed to have given up on complaining for the time being. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It left drifts that rounded the edges of buildings and blurred the details of Kettle Creek into a stark mass of vagueness. The wind, now a banshee's wail, flitted through the streets in a tone that was oppressive and desperate. It chilled the bone the way the cold chilled the air, or it would have if there were anyone to aggress. As it was, the streets were as empty as they were featureless. The few citizens that still clung to the old ghost of a town stayed indoors where thin walls and meager fires did little to support their delusions of safety.
What is the Bosnian city in which an assassination triggered World War I?
Annie was asking. Sarajevo, Steve answered quickly. Now how the fuck did you know that? Rob asked him. I guess I paid attention in history class, he said with a wry smile.
Okay,
Tabby said.
What city was burned in 1812 to deprive Napoleon of a winter base?
Moscow, Steve said, a definite air of smugness about him now. What the fuck? Rob asked, his mouth hanging open. Dude, I knew that one, Anton said. Bullshit. No, really, I did.
Okay, Anton, here's one for you. You said you were a fan of horror movies. Clive Barker's Hellraiser is based on what 1986 novella?
Anton thought for a moment, resting his head in his hand. Tales of a Hellbound Heart or something like that. Tabby turned the card over and looked at it.
Close, it's just the Hellbound Heart.
Good enough for government work, Steve said.
Is that the one with the guy with all the pins in his head?
She asked, putting the card back in the box. Yeah, Anton said. Only the first two were any good, though. Rob read off, which female figure skater won gold at the 1992 Winter Olympics? This time Annie said,
Oh, I know this one. It was Christy Yamaguchi. I remember seeing that on TV. She was so amazing.
Rob just nodded and put the card back.
I remember wanting to be just like her when I was a kid. She was wearing this gorgeous gold and black outfit and just danced across the ice. It was so beautiful.
Annie said, all too aware now that everyone was looking at her. She pulled her blanket around herself protectively.
Did you skate?
Tabby asked her.
I did when I was a kid. Why'd you give it up? Just fell out of it, I guess. I can't imagine being up in front of all those people like that. There was this one point where Christy messed up on a triple loop. Her hand touched the ice, only for a second. If that were me, I would have fallen apart completely. Nancy Kerrigan was right behind her in points. There was so much pressure.
Kerrigan's the one who paid that guy to break that other girl's leg, right? Rob asked.
No, that was Tanya Harding. Nancy was the one who was attacked, and that was in 94.
Annie wrapped the blanket around herself more tightly. The others looked so much more cheerful than before. Why then could she not join them? Why couldn't she just let it go and have a good time too? She slipped back from them mentally. crawling backward to a shadowy corner inside herself, only semi-aware as they continued to fire questions at one another. It felt wrong, like she was behind glass, looking out at the rest of the world, but it also felt familiar. She suddenly wanted to be home desperately, Henry's fingers brushing through her hair, his presence making her feel safe, banishing these anxious feelings. "Where would one visit to see the Sea of Tranquility?" Steve asked. Annie knew, but just now she would rather not speak. She felt ill. A moment passed and no one else offered an answer. "The moon," Steve said, turning the card over. "Shit," Anton laughed. "I should have known that. I remember that now from science class in high school."
I didn't know there was water on the moon,
Tabby said. "No, it's not," Anton began, but Rob cut him short. "What's that?" he asked. His arm was outstretched and he was pointing. All eyes were on him, following the invisible line of his finger to something on the wall. Annie came back to herself, staring in disbelief with the others. It was a note, held in place with a bright green thumbtack. Rob stood up, letting his blanket fall to the floor and cross the room. He pulled the note from the wall. His eyes scanned and his face flashed a mixture of horror and confusion. "What the fuck is this?" he demanded, waving the note. "Well, I sure as hell can't tell you from over there," Steve said. Rob walked over and handed the note off to Steve, who placed it on the floor so everyone could see it. It was handwritten on a piece of torn-out notebook paper. It read, "Justine was mine. You had no right to take her from me. I will not be backed into a corner. I will not submit. I'm going to kill you all." There was a long moment as no one said anything. Then finally, Tabby broke the silence.
Is this you, Anton?
She asked, not quite knowing what to make of the message. "Is what me?" he asked.
Did you write this?
He stared at her incredulously. "I don't even know anyone named Justine." "This has got to be some kind of a joke," Rob said. Steve looked back at the place where it had been tacked to the wall. "Was that there when we came in?" he asked. No way," Rob said. "Couldn't have been. We would have seen it."
We could have missed it,
Annie said, but felt unconvinced herself. "In an empty room? Your eyes would have gone right to that spot," Rob said. "One of us had to have put it there."
Okay, this isn't funny, you guys.
Tabby said, a tone of anger and fear creeping into her voice.
Which one of you wrote it?
The room exchanged glances.
Anton, did you...
Tabby began again, but he cut her off in mid-sentence, no longer containing his irritation at her. "Tabby, I didn't fucking write it," he snapped. "Anton," Steve said calmly. "Calm down. Look at the facts here. Look at the frayed edges. The note was written on notebook paper ripped out of a spiral notebook. None of us has a notebook like that with us, right?" They all shook their heads. "And what Rob said about noticing it when we came in makes sense. But at the same time, it would be equally as hard for one of us to have tacked it to the wall without anyone else noticing." "So what are you saying?" asked Rob. "I'm saying," Steve replied, "that to me, it looks like one of the workers did it for someone else in the crew, some kind of inside joke." "And how did we all miss seeing it when we came in?" asked Anton. "I don't know," Steve conceded, "but apparently we did. How else would it have gotten there?" "I don't know," Anton said. Steve looked at Tabby, who still looked frightened. "It's just a note, Tabby." He ripped it in half. "Just someone's idea of a joke."
Well, it isn't funny,
Tabby said. No one was laughing. The fire was inside the walls now, like a living thing. It blackened the drywall, making the paint bubble and bulge before snaking outward in long tongues of flame, consuming hungrily, filling the house with thick, black smoke. Annie was crying, terrified, calling out to her mother for help, but there was nothing to be found in the cold depths of her eyes but calm indifference. She had the detached look of a woman watching something on a movie screen.
Mom!
Annie screamed at her mother, who sat cradled in her father's arms on the living room couch.
Mom, why won't you listen to me? Where's Brian?
Her mother asked, regarding her with a loveless stare.
Mom, the fire! We need to get out! Where is Brian?
The mother repeated apathetically.
Where is your brother? I don't know! Mommy, I'm scared! Brian is your responsibility, her mother said, dismissing her fears with callous indifference.
Annie bit her lip. Brian was her responsibility. She must be strong. She raced through the room to the stairs to her little brother's bedroom. Fire rolled across the walls and blanketed the ceiling. It was like looking down the barrel of a hellish kaleidoscope. The entire hall seemed in constant motion. The effect was dizzying. She barreled down the upstairs hall, sweat pouring from her body from fear and heat. She stopped outside her brother's bedroom door and bellowed his name. Light and smoke seeped from beneath the door in sheets. "Help me, Annie!" came a voice from inside the room. She grabbed the door handle and blinding pain exploded in her hand. She tried to pull away from the source, but it wouldn't come easily. The heat had grafted her flesh to the knob. It peeled away from her palm in long, gooey strands. She sank to her knees, holding her wounded hand against her chest, crying her brother's name. "Annie, it burns! Help me!"
I can't get in!
She cried miserably. "Annie!" She felt her heart beating in her seared nerves. She stumbled to her feet, but they felt weak, and her stomach felt like retching in pain. Still, she threw her body against the door heavily. "Annie!" Cradling her wounded hand, she threw her shoulder into the wooden obstruction again and again. She continued until she was numb all along her right side. She continued until she felt sure she must have fractured her shoulder, and still she battered the door. "Annie, I'm burning!" Brian called pathetically from within. He sounded further away now. She kicked out with all her might, sending a painful shock up her leg that found its aching home in her lower back. Finally, with one more solid slam from her shoulder, the door frame exploded into splinters, and the door swung inward, depositing her onto her face. The room was an inferno. Fire coated the walls and ceiling in a tremendous pleated curtain. The heat and smoke stung Annie's nose harshly. And hidden there as well was something worse, something like the odor of grilling hot dogs. She got to her feet, looking down at her brother lying spread eagle on his Ninja Turtle bedspread. The child's corpse was nothing but a blackened skeleton, steaming and crackling as it cooled. Tapers of charred flesh clung to its ribs, and its empty, sightless eye sockets seemed to glare at her accusingly. "You let me die, Annie," the corpse said, its mouth unmoving. "I was your responsibility, and you let me burn." "No!" she cried, sinking to her knees, her face inches from the begrimed skull. "I trusted you, Annie. You were my sister. You were supposed to take care of me," it rasped. She saw that as it spoke, something moved within its mouth, behind its black cage of teeth. A tongue? If his tongue was moving, her brother might still be alive. She leaned in, desperately looking for movement. Then, suddenly, the mouth opened, and something lunged up at her, the long, grinning, serpentine face of a moray eel. The animal snapped at her exposed face viciously, forcing its way out of the mouth's ruined throat with an unsettling sucking sound. Instinctively, she batted at the animal, sending Brian's skull spinning from his body to the floor, where it shattered like brittle pottery. The bloated fish flopped spastically. "You let me burn!" His voice condemned her from the pieces. "You let me die!" She raced from the room, down the hall and down the stairs, wailing. The fire had spread now, and the stairs broke apart as she stepped on them, but somehow she made it to the bottom without stumbling. "Mommy!" she screamed. But where her mother and father had been was now only a bare couch, now awash with flames. Still, her mother's voice issued from that spot.
"It's your fault your brother is dead. You deserve to burn." "No, Mommy!"
she cried.
"Where are you? I can't see you!" "It's your fault,"
the flames told her, and the couch collapsed in on itself, tearing a gaping black hole in the floor. Annie ran for the front door, but the entire room was in motion. It sunk inward toward the hole as it widened into a maw. Tables and lamps crashed to the ground and rushed toward the hole. The television, still flashing a phantasmagoria of pictures, hurtled itself into the dark. The harder she ran, the harder the blackness tried to swallow her. Then, unbelievably, her hand was on the doorknob and she was through, onto the front porch. The moment the door swung open, heat blasted her face, searing her tears dry. The earth itself was on fire. Houses burned like match heads. as flames licked their way up the telephone poles before dancing across the broken high-voltage wires. In the red sky above, birds caught fire and trailed, screaming to the ground. The sun was a puncture in the sky which oozed liquid magma onto an advancing ocean of fire. The landscape drowned under its advance, sending curls of flame upward as shapes sank beneath the lava. There was nowhere she could run. She felt invisible hands of heat embracing her, searing her flesh. Her hair caught first, burning quickly and leaving her head bald and disfigured. The world went dark as her eyes popped in their sockets like overripe grapes. It tore the clothes from her body and the flesh from her bones. She tried to scream, but the fire and smoke stifled her. She tried to draw breath, but her lungs burned in agony as they collapsed and shriveled. The pain and heat bore down on her, pressing and compressing her. She spiraled into the darkness as the world was wrenched from her, leaving nothing but the terrible odor of grilling hot dogs, the smell of cooking human flesh. Annie awoke from the nightmare with a start. Had she cried out? She looked around the room, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. No one else was moving. She could feel her heart beat in her fingertips. Sweat gathered uncomfortably at the small of her back. The nightmare was a familiar one, partially a fabrication of her tormented mind and partly a real memory. She'd been having the same one or one similar since she was a child. Her unconscious mind seemed to be unwilling to ever stop torturing her in her sleep. She'd lost more than her family in that fire. She'd lost her ability to ever truly feel safe. It stood there like an intruder in the doorway of her psyche, ready to pounce whenever her guard was down. She pushed herself into a sitting position. Her back ached from sleeping on the bare floor. In the still of the night, she could hear only her own heart thumping in her ears as it slowly returned to normal rhythm. And the choked snores of... Who was that, anyway? Steve? Rob? Upon closer inspection, she noticed that Rob was no longer there. He must be walking the halls somewhere. She abhorred the thought of stalking off into the dark with the nightmare so fresh in her mind, but she was equally disquieted by the prospect of lying here with only her thoughts for company. In the end, she decided to get up and go look for him. She knew she wouldn't be able to shake off the nightmare and get back to sleep that easily, and she might do well with someone to talk to. She walked out into the hallway. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the tile floor. Down the long, narrow corridor, moonlight spilled through the tiny rectangular windows. The snowstorm outside muted every ambient sound and added to the claustrophobic feeling that the world outside of the school had just disappeared. Down at the end of the corridor, she imagined she could see a figure standing to the side, where the hall made a left. In the false light of the room, it was hard to see, but the figure was man-shaped and broad-shouldered.
Rob!
She called out to him.
I was looking for you.
But the dark figure did not answer. Fear boiled to the surface, rooted deep within her gut. She felt his eyes on her. She tried unconvincingly to tell herself that she'd imagined it, a trick of the light and shadow.
Rob!
She called again, hearing a waver in her voice.
Rob, is that you?
When the figure did not answer a second time, she willed herself to move. Her feet were numb with fear, but she forced herself forward. As she approached, she became more and more convinced that she'd imagined the figure, that what she'd mistaken for a man was merely a shadow from the locker banks. Then it moved, turning on its heel and disappearing around the corner. She froze in her tracks, her heartbeat once again pumping faster as her adrenal glands dumped a fresh batch of adrenaline into her bloodstream. She made up her mind before she even knew what she was doing. She would not let her fear control her. She would not go back to the lounge and cower like a child under her blanket. She had to know what she'd seen. Her hands and face going numb and her legs feeling like they were dragging lead weights, she followed the phantom. Around that next corner, the hall was empty, but she could faintly hear the echo of footfalls somewhere up ahead. She pushed herself into a jog, making up the lost distance. Rounding another bend, she found herself in front of a set of bathrooms. The footfalls had disappeared. She padded to a stop, looking down the long corridor. If there was someone there, Shouldn't they still be visible? Was it possible that she'd imagined the entire thing? The feeling of being watched returned. Eyes full of malice glared at her from the darkness of uncertainty. The hallway back suddenly felt like a gauntlet of fear and humiliation. What would the others think if she made it back and broke down under her blanket, blubbering like a child? She didn't want to be here. She wanted to be at home. She wanted to be in Henry's warm, muscular arms. She put her back to the wall, slid to a sitting position, and dissolved into tears. Rob stared into the bathroom mirror. Part of him didn't want to accept that what he was seeing was even his own face. The sadness had him now, and he had to admit that it had him by the balls. He looked down at his rapidly diminishing bag of powder, and then back into his own face. His eyes looked hollow and dead, his skin rough and pockmarked. "This is why the dead are grateful, Jerry," he told his reflection absurdly. He knew his habit had grown from a weekend recreation into an after-school special-style monster that destroyed lives. God, this felt like shit. He hung his head and turned it from side to side, feeling his neck crack. He turned on the cold water and put his balled fists into the flow. The feeling grounded him as the water flowed over his knuckles, but not in a comforting way. It felt too real. He was too aware, and the world was wrong. He was wrong. He took a deep breath. He knew he was going to have to take some more to get right. I don't need enough to get real high, he thought. Just enough to get right. He spilled a measure of cocaine onto the webbing between his forefinger and thumb, lifted it to his nose, and inhaled it. It hardly even burned anymore. It rolled over him at once, lifting the veil inside his head. His heart raced and the edge dulled. He felt right again, but he knew he was still wrong. That this feeling of elation was the real lie. Maybe he could get help. But then what? New friends? A whole new life? Was that even possible? He held the baggie up before his eyes. There wasn't a lot left. Enough to get him through the weekend, maybe. He would need to call Rennie early again this week. He splashed some water on his face and turned off the faucet, running his fingers through his hair. With the sound of running water gone, he could hear something else from outside the bathroom. It sounded like a woman crying. He twisted the baggie shut and shoved it into his pocket, then pushed his way out of the bathroom door. Annie sat on the floor, propped against the opposite wall, her arms hugging her knees to her chest. She was crying loudly and shaking. "Annie?" he said and rushed over to her. She looked up and sniffled, embarrassed, trying to wipe the tears off of her reddening cheeks. Her curly, wet bangs stuck to her face like spider webs. "What's wrong?" he asked her.
"Nothing,"
she replied hastily.
"I'm okay,
You don't look okay. Seriously, I'm not going to rag on you or anything. Tell me what happened."
It's stupid,"
she said.
"I just had a nightmare."
He nodded and sat down beside her, giving her a moment to catch her breath and composure. "Tell me about it." She took a long time before answering.
"There was a fire. The one that killed my parents and kid brother."
"Do you get them a lot?" he asked.
"Too often,"
she said. He let the moment swell, not quite sure how to comfort her.
"I came looking for you when I noticed that you were out of bed too,"
she said finally.
"I saw you in the hallway. Why didn't you answer me when I called out to you?"
He looked surprised. "I guess I didn't hear you. You sure it was me?"
"Who else could it have been?"
she asked. "Everyone else is still asleep?" he asked.
"Yeah,"
she said.
"but honestly, it was really dark. I guess I could have imagined it. I was already upset because of the nightmare."
"Probably," he said, getting to his feet and offering her hand to help her up. Then again, he trailed off.
"What?"
she asked seriously as he helped her to her feet. "Nothing. Don't worry about it. I don't want to worry you,"
"No, come on. Now you have to tell me. Seriously,"
she said. Her tone was playful, but it only thinly veiled the fear that shone in her every mannerism. "It's not a big deal. I just thought that there's a possibility that it could have been someone else. Like a squatter, some homeless guy or something, taking shelter from the blizzard. Nothing to worry about, really, especially if we stay in a group." She didn't look convinced. That's why I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to worry you. It's just a possibility is all. I'll walk back with you, I promise. I won't leave your side.
Okay.
She said.
I'm just glad you didn't try to convince me that it was some kind of mad ghost or something.
Not my style, I smiled. I'll leave the ghost stories to Anton.
Do you believe in all that stuff?
She asked. I'll keep your secret if you keep mine, he said.
Deal.
She agreed. Scares the shit out of me, he said with a grin. She beamed at him. He pulled a flashlight out of his pocket and turned it on. Here, he said. This'll keep the dark off us. Let's walk back. She nodded and took his hand. In the short time that she had known Rob, she'd only known him to be immature and vivacious. She was pleasantly surprised to find this more sympathetic side to him. He wore it well. They were almost back to the lounge when she noticed something strange up ahead. A door down the hall and to the left was standing open. That's weird, he said.
I'm guessing that wasn't open when you came by the last time?
She mused, making it more of a fact than a question. Yeah, in fact, I'm almost sure I shut it myself earlier tonight. It leads to the basement. She thought for a moment about the eerie feeling Henry had described to her when he'd explored the ruins as a teenager.
Think your squatter could be down there?
Could be, he conceded with a shrug. Only one way to find out for sure. We should definitely check into it, but let me go wake up Anton and Steve first, just in case there is some sort of trouble. She felt frightened, but she promised herself she wasn't going to let her fear resurface. Having Rob here made all the difference, and it probably was just some old drifter. She screwed her courage on tight, squeezed his hand in an affirming way.
Let's go down and check it out. I'll be here to protect you.
He smiled at her. You got spunk, lady, he said, and they went through the door. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you like what you've heard so far, please consider supporting my Patreon. I try to do this for free, but I do have to support myself somehow. Also, physical copies of my books are available